Welcome back to Let's Talk Politics. Today on the show, we have David Boudeweel-Lefebvre, a recognized expert in government and public affairs with 20 years of experience navigating politics, lobbying, and coalition building. As the founder of Boudeweel Public Affairs, David's business has found a way to bridge the gap between Quebec and English Canada, helping businesses and policymakers navigate the country's complex political landscape in both official languages. In this episode, we dive deep into Quebec's evolving political scene, exploring its cultural preservation efforts, the impact of tariffs on key industries, and the province's strategies for economic resilience. David shares his insights on the Conservative Party's approach to Quebec, the Bloc Québécois' growing influence, and what the next federal election could mean for Canada's future. Whether you're passionate about politics or just curious about what's next for Canada and Quebec, this conversation is packed with fascinating insights you won't want to miss. Let's talk politics with David Boudeweel-Lefebvre. Hello, David. How are you?
Good morning, Julia.
I'm so excited to have you on. Today, we're going to be talking everything from Quebec politics to your business to consulting, policy, all across the political board. So I just wanted to start off saying how you have a very unique Quebec perspective working in conservative governments and also starting your own firm. I really wish we could be doing this interview in French, but unfortunately, Southern Ontario didn't teach me good enough French. But we'll kind of be talking about some of those issues as well. The first thing I want to ask you is, what do you think some of the biggest misconceptions English Canada has about Quebec politics and vice versa?
I'm running a business and having regular contacts with English Canada for about 15 years now. The thing is, when they talk about there's two solitudes, there's French Canada and English Canada, it's true, but the burden of the responsibility is not only in English Canada, it's on French Canada as well. I would say the biggest misconception is that Quebec is very complicated. You need to have special access to do it. Apart from the language, yes, for real, it's a different political culture. But at the same time, it's not impossible to know Quebecers and to do business with them and to work with them, right? Because at the core, they're like any other regular humans. So they just want to better their lives for themselves and their family, understanding they have specific historical and political history and culture. But at the same time, the biggest misconception is that for some people, it feels impossible to do it. But when you have the right conduit and you do the right things, well, you can definitely do business and even do politics in French Canada.
Coming from the Toronto-centric perspective of things, is really interesting to see how different, I wouldn't say completely different, like you said, dynamics, but there's definitely a uniqueness to it in the sense of preserving culture. And I think that's what comes to, from my perspective, one of the central of ideas, making sure that's emphasized, whether it be through language or other policies that come through. But shifting a little bit, I want to talk more about your firm. You've had such a dynamic career over 2 decades in, as I mentioned, politics, public affairs, communications, and business development. How have you come to found your consulting firm, and what drew you to public affairs in the first place?
Well, I'll start with the end of your question, which is what drew me to public affairs. Always been interested in public affairs, politics in general, watching the news, reading the newspaper. I remember when I was very young, the election of 1984, I remember watching the leaders debate. I was only 9 years old. One of the first time I was at the grown-up tables at Christmas, for example, when I spoke about different things like school, nobody really cared. But when I spoke about politics or current affairs, then people started to have an interest. So it's always been something that's been put at the forefront for my family. And I work in politics for many years. For me, I found importance and interest in what government affairs people do and in helping people devise the policy. And also, it's a way to advocate. Working for a client that advocates for the things that you believe in is also a way to shift the public narrative and to also do some kind of politics by being on the other side of the aisle. So I was really interested in public affairs, and the idea to launch my firm was that I had more than 10 years experience in public affairs at the time. Started my business on November 15, 2020, and I don't regret it for a second.
Yeah, most entrepreneurs, I've also dabbled into that space, and you really don't regret it because it's so powerful to work for yourself. And I think there's a passion driven behind it. But your firm specifically is very unique in the sense that we've talked about this before, but bridges the gap for some businesses interacting with whether it be other Quebec businesses or government. Realistically, when it comes to the business side of things or policy, we can say in Ontario or maybe other provinces, yes, we speak French, but coming back to how unique the culture is and the mannerisms and even colloquially how you say certain things, it really is important when it comes to those business relationships. So I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit more about how that's been for you, helping bridge that gap and maybe some work you do with other consulting firms?
Yes, that's a good point, because the whole idea of the business is it's not a business for itself. It's based on a void and a need that we figured that was in the market. And by the way, there's even more void in the market now than there was when we launched business in 2020. So well, the idea was that we figured out that a lot of people in English Canada were having the wrong reaction to Quebec. First reaction was, so complicated, French speaking, I don't want to go there, I don't want to do business there, I don't want to have to do with it, let's bury it under the sand, and hopefully nobody notices that we do. And the second thing, which was an improvement, is some people started to hire French-speaking resource to do the work in Quebec. It's not perfect, but at least you want to understand the market that you want to approach and work in. The problem is if you're French-speaking from Ontario or New Brunswick or other places in the country, yes, you speak French, but you're not born and raised and versed in the Quebec culture, which is specific enough. Like, for example, I speak English, but I wouldn't go lobbying in Edmonton, pretending, oh, I speak English, so you understand I'm very close to Northern Alberta. So people were doing a little bit the same thing. And the third reaction, which also made sense, was, well, we're going to try to find the right conduit in Quebec. But of course, those people, those firms knew that their clients didn't speak French or didn't know what to do. So they charge a very hefty price. So we've come in the market to be able to bridge that divide between English Canada and being able to do the work in Quebec at a reasonable price, but also with people that are senior consultants and that able to really deliver the goods.
Absolutely. And again, that's a perfect fit, I think, especially with the political climate right now and the economic climate, as we're looking to move more towards interprovincial trade, interprovincial business, especially with the looming U.S. tariffs coming in. Premier Legault has emphasized the potential economic impact to tariffs under Trump's administration. What do you think are some specific strategies Quebec might pursue to protect key industries that are held there, like aerospace, life sciences, and mining, from these threats? Because it's really ramping up.
Well, Quebec is a special province in terms of the tariffs, like Alberta and Ontario are. They're all different, but Quebec has basically developed a lot of its economy around a few specific heavy industrial sector. Mining, like you said, is a good example. Aluminum smelters is another one. So Quebec's a little bit less compared to Ontario. Retail businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. The percentage of large businesses in Quebec in its economy is bigger than in some of the other provinces. Quebec's challenge is really specific to the tariffs, especially on aluminum and steel and other products. So those 25% tariffs are very important to Quebec because it does a lot of its commerce and trade with the United States, a little bit less with other provinces compared to the rest of the country. I would say tariffs are important for every Canadian, but I would say specifically important for Quebec. And the other thing that explained the strong reaction of Quebec is that, and this goes back to the 1970s and 1980s, Quebec arguably has been the most pro-free trade province in the country and for a long time. Like Brian Mulroney won its overwhelming majority in 1988 in Quebec based on the free trade discussion with the United States. So the tariffs that Trump proposes Quebec's are a little bit more insulted, I would say, because they say, we've always been really in favor of the free trade. We base a lot of our economy on, and now we need to react to this.
The Quebec National Assembly returned back to its parliamentary session, and that included the appointment of Simon Jolin Barrette. I hope I said that right.
Pretty good.
Who's now responsible for Canada relations. How do you anticipate Quebec's interactions with the federal government evolving, particularly around these trade and economic negotiations? Again, having this appointment, do you think this is going to shift dynamics? Do you think it will strengthen these conversations with the federal government?
Yeah, so Simon Jolin Barrette, who is still the Minister of Justice, he's also the parliamentary leader or House leader for the governing party in Quebec. He's really Premier Legault political right-hand man. So the fact that he's put into this position definitely shows how much intergovernmental relationship for Quebec has become a priority. I think Quebec sees the relationship with the rest of the country on two different axes. The first axis is economic. So in terms of the economic axis, basically the government of Quebec wants to push the federal government to find the right arrangements to the benefit of Canadians and Quebecers without going to the brink and have kind of a trade war and a tariff war. Premier Legault, he's been on record saying, if there's a tariff war, this is what we're going to do. But our best case scenario is for this not to happen. I think on economics, you're going to see a lot of discussion about removing some trade barriers between different provinces. It being really like a classic free trader, Quebecer, both inside the Federation and outside the Federation. The second axis will be on culture, language, and the question of some very specific laws in Quebec that have been put in place by the government that are now contested at the Supreme Court level with some judges that have been appointed by the current federal government. So Simon-Jeannin Barrette will have the dual role of promote the economics, but also play defense for Quebec in terms of those cultural issues and to basically defend the right of Quebec to do certain laws, even if sometimes they have to use the notwithstanding clause regarding the Canadian Constitution, invoking principles that they want to protect some part of the Quebec and French-speaking cultural fabric.
Really important stuff. One thing we don't talk about, I think, as Canadians is how much of barriers it is for interprovincial trade and how much taxes actually get inputted on those pieces. It should be really interesting how this plays out and seeing his role evolve as well when it this such politically tense time. And as we're talking about federal relationships, what your thoughts are on the current federal political landscape with the government being in limbo until March. What key priorities do you think that parties should be focusing on while we're in this limbo period? Because tariffs seem to be really focusing the conversation now, a lot of Canadian anxieties. But yeah, I'm just curious on what you think about the political landscape and what maybe the party should be doing in this interim time.
Well, that's a good question because, of course, there were a lot of upheavals, to say the least, at the federal level over the last 2 months. We now have a Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, that's on the exit, but at the same time, with the tariffs and Trump, arguably he has his most important role since he came into power in 2015, right? Maybe compared to the first renegotiation of the USMCA Accord, but basically right now, it's all Canadians, you would ask them, what's the most important task of the federal government right now? Probably 80 to 85% would say the important is to make sure we do the right things on the tariffs, or we fight back against Donald Trump, or we assure our sovereignty, or something akin to that. I think politically it will pretty quickly come back to pocketbook issues. Arguably, tariffs are also about pocketbook issue for a lot of people that are scared about losing their job, having to pay more for certain products or produce that they use. So I think we're going to go back to that. One thing I think it's positive from my standpoint is, I think the federal Liberals have gone very far into digging a deficit, cranking the debt up, putting on new taxes. It seems that their leadership candidates want to move a little bit more to the center, a little bit like Jacques Chrétien and Paul Martin were. So I think in terms of the political discourse, we're going to go more into, I would say, a more advanced economic discussion. And it's probably going to be the theme of the next campaign, whether it is discussed through the prism of the tariffs or just regular domestic economic issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into the Liberal leadership race in a bit as well. But a few points I want to pick out from there because it is a huge shock to the system for businesses. Before we hopped on, I saw a reel on Instagram of people panic buying eggs. Bird flu going on and these price increases. So it's really scary. As I keep emphasizing, I feel like I'm just always on the edge of my seat. I'm just curious on how you think political parties should navigate the challenges of appealing to both Quebec and the rest of Canada. Is this something from your experience working in the political side? Are there any specific strategies we'll be potentially seeing from each party? Because they typically do have to run their campaigns differently, culture, all these things we talked about compared to the rest of Canada. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting question because the saying goes that the government is elected in Ontario, but whether it's a majority or a minority is decided in Quebec, right? Just because of the number of seats and sometimes the way that it's been divided in the country. Right now in Quebec, and the Conservatives, they have a certain number of seats. They're about 10 to 11. They can probably grow to maybe to 16 seats. But to go over that would require a significant dedication of resource, political capital, and political power to do this. And at the same time, if you pander a little bit too much to Quebec, you risk antagonizing Ontario, especially the GTA, maybe the rest of the country. So strategically and numerically, if there's a wave in Quebec like there was for Jack Layton in 2011, there's nothing you can do to push it or to prevent it. It doesn't happen because you're really good. It happens because of other circumstances. So the Conservative probably should just say, well, let's do as good as we can in the rest of the country in English Canada and in Quebec. Let's be satisfied with between 12 and 15 ridings. Stephen Harper had a majority government in 2011 with only 5 MPs from Quebec. I'd like to be a little bit more representation in Quebec. But if you have 12 to 15, don't go crazy. Don't risk the whole ship to save the captain's cabin. Of course, the Bloc Québécois would be a big opponent. And if I was the Liberals, I would put sometimes in Quebec, if only because you have a lot of seats to defend that risk switching to the Bloc. And like you said, with the numbers that we see in the polls, there could be, a scenario where the Bloc Québécois would be the official opposition, though I don't truly believe it. I don't think the Liberal vote will crater deep enough that the Liberals will do worse than under Michael Ignatieff in 2011, where they had 34 seats. But I still think Quebec will mainly be a fight between the Liberals and the Bloc, and the Conservatives with their stronghold in Quebec City, around Quebec City, probably stretching it a little bit more north and west, but, being happy and satisfied with 12 to 15 seats, and the rest will be in the balance between the Bloc Québécois and the Liberals. Liberals being a bit stronger in Montreal, Bloc being a little bit more stronger in the rural regions, and everything in between being a toss-up.
It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And on that note, with the Bloc Québécois, Quebec has long maintained that distinct political identity within Canada, and we've seen that reflected federally with the prominence of the Bloc Québécois, led by François Blanchet, as the third largest party currently with this government in session. What do you think has driven this growing support for the Bloc Québécois, and what do you think that indicates with the political mood in Quebec?
So the Bloc Québécois, since its inception, has always been its strongest when the other parties were at their weakest. Okay, Quebec voters like at the federal level not to have to overly commit and decide the government. So yes, we can decide if it's majority or minority, but Quebec voters in general like to park their votes with people that will be good watchdogs of government and be able, keep the federal government in check. And if there's something crazy as the sponsorship scandal from the Liberal in 2004, or like Stephen Harper wanted to send troops in Iraq, let's make sure we have people in the middle of the road that are willing to fight for Quebec and make sure that we don't go to one extreme or to the other, and that we can keep the government in check. When Jack Layton had the wave in Quebec and 59 or 60s MPs, it was a little bit the same reaction, right? We're ready to quit on the Bloc Québécois because we don't like them what to do, but at the same time, we don't want to make sure that we support one of the two main parties. So here came Layton, he was not going to form government, so it was still safe to vote for him, right? Now what we see in the dynamics is that as Justin Trudeau has fallen out of favor in Quebec as in the rest of the country, well, now the Bloc Québécois rises a little bit more. So it's not the Conservatives that are at 35% in the poll. It's not the NDP. It's, again, a party that is less threatening, not going to have power, but going to have the possibility to be a watchdog. So I would say this is the main appeal of the Bloc Québécois. You cannot read in it that more Quebecers wants to separate or Quebecers don't want to have anything to do with the federal government. It's not the situation. It's just that the party fills a void anytime that there is resentment towards the party in power or obvious scandals or other reasons to try to punish a government in place.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like they're a bit, and I feel like even how Blanchet's been leading the party, very neutral, right? They don't jump to one extreme over the other when it comes to the different parties putting ideas forward. Like they'll hold the Liberals accountable for seniors and pensions, but also side with the Liberals on other topics as well. So it's really interesting to see that neutrality, and it makes sense why there's that appeal when everything feels like it's on fire, but that's the most kind of constant in political.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is something, when you asked the first question, some miscomprehension between English and French Canadians. The Bloc Québécois is behaving basically as if they were in a pluralistic, proportional European parliament, right? Not in a Westminster-style parliament where they're ready to work with the left, the right, the center, depending on the issues that is important to their own constituency. So you have some kind of those parties in Europe that are agrarian parties in favor of the farmers, or you would have leftist party that are in favor of unionized workers and things like that, which are very specific. The Bloc Québécois is a little bit like that, but it's specific to Quebec and French-speaking people in Canada. So this is a way to understand their behavior, because I know quite a few conservatives that are literally pissed at the Bloc has helped the Liberals. But I know some Liberals that are pissed and they say, oh, no, the Bloc helps the Conservatives, right? So it means that they're really willing to forge alliances as they go. Not to say they don't play politics and they want to make sure that they can keep their seats, but they're a party that is quite different in the federal arena. The NDP is a little bit like that, but they only deal with the Liberals. They don't deal with the other parties, right? So it's a little bit different.
Very, very strategic. And also from my experience, seeing who we're partnering with on different issues on committee. Obviously, Liberals were in a minority government, but needing that extra help to boost things. And sometimes you wouldn't be aligned with the NDP, but the Bloc were there to support. You can really see the Bloc Québécois prioritizing the needs of their constituents, because I personally have felt like politics has become way more ideological, and it's kind of lost that idea of what do my constituents actually want? Like, affordability is a huge crisis now. Why aren't we talking about that more? Why aren't we seeing more policies put forward about this? So it's really interesting. And I can see that appeal again when we talk about those dynamics of Quebec and typically how people vote. It's really important. And now that you're explaining it this way, also understand that appeal for the Bloc Québécois. Thanks for listening to part 1 of the Quebec Perspective, Policy, Politics, and U.S. Tariffs on Let's Talk Politics. Don't miss part 2, where David and I explore the Liberal leadership race and Quebec's evolving political landscape. We'll also explore key moments in Quebec's political history, from referendums and separatist movements, plus how government relations are adapting in an increasingly complex world. I'm your host, Julia Pinella. See you next week, and let's talk politics.